So in this video, I'm going to go over the three main ways to strengthen an argument on the SAT reading and writing section. And I'll get into some specific examples in just a minute, but to briefly outline what those three ways are, really the most common way is going to simply be to provide evidence to support the argument when none has been given. So in other words, they'll state a conclusion. They might say something like, an experiment was performed, or these researchers performed an analysis, but they won't say anything about the results of that experiment or that analysis. And so the answer choice is going to basically supply that evidence. Okay, now the second most common way to strengthen an argument would be to provide additional evidence when some is given. Okay, when some evidence is given, but that evidence is incomplete. And typically what's going to happen in these situations is you'll have your conclusion, you'll have your partial evidence, and you'll need to come up with some additional evidence or find the answer that supplies that additional evidence that sort of fills in the gap between the partial evidence and the conclusion. And then the third way, which is not as common, but will show up. It will show up, and that is going to be to weaken or rule out a potential alternative explanation for the evidence. And so in this scenario, as with scenario 2, there will be some evidence given, but instead of giving additional positive evidence in support of the argument that we're trying to support, we're going to come up with evidence that weakens, again, a potential alternative explanation. But let's go ahead and get into some examples, starting with that most common way of providing evidence when none has been given. So, unofficial question, but modeled on the kind of thing that you will see on the test. And so it asks, which finding, if true, would most directly support the researcher's claim? And so we read the passage. It says that migratory birds, such as barnacle geese, travel thousands of kilometers each year between their breeding grounds and wintering habitats. In a recent study, researchers examined fossilized feathers from multiple Paleogene period, doesn't matter when that was, it was just a long time ago. Okay, avian species, avian meaning birds. Okay, so avian species using a combination of this and that methods. Methods aren't that important in these questions, generally speaking. Okay, their results led them to conclude that at least one species of Paleogene birds was homeothermic, meaning it maintained a stable internal body temperature and likely possessed the metabolic adaptations necessary to support long-distance migration. They argue that homeothermy would have been especially advantageous during extended flights over cold or high-altitude regions. Okay, and so what is their claim? It's kind of made in two different places. We see here that, they conclude, and so that's going to be a part of it, that at least one species of this bird was homeothermic and therefore likely possessed the adaptations necessary to make long-distance migrations, and that homeothermy would have allowed them to make these flights over cold and high altitude regions. So kind of a long claim there, but that's going to be the claim. What evidence do we have to support this claim within the passage? None, right? It just says that they performed an analysis. It doesn't say anything about the results of that analysis. So what we want to do here is think about, well, what kind of result would support this claim? Well, if we want to say that these birds possess the metabolic adaptations necessary to support long-distance migration, we want evidence that these birds migrated over long distances, and specifically long distances that included cold or high altitude regions. I guess high altitude regions are probably going to be cold, generally speaking. A region doesn't have to be high altitude to be cold, but I'm just going to put a slash there. Okay, Starting with A, structural protein markers indicating homeothermy have been identified in several types of birds, not just in migratory species. Well, that may be true, but that's not the important thing here, because even though they mention structural protein markers in the passage, that's not really involved in the claim that they're making, so that's going to be one of the irrelevant options. B, fossilized feathers from both migratory and non-migratory birds have been found in temperate lowland regions with relatively stable year-round temperatures. Well, in this case, that's not going to strengthen it because they're specifically talking about homeothermic birds. And the idea would be that homeothermic birds have an advantage in terms of their ability to migrate over long distances. They have an advantage over birds that are not homeothermic. So we don't want an answer choice that lumps these birds together with non-homeothermic birds. That's what B is doing. And I think I'd have to maybe think about it a little bit more, but on first glance here, that would seem to weaken it because it is lumping this kind of bird together with another kind of bird when we really would want to emphasize the difference between homeothermic and non-homeothermic birds. Okay, so on to C. Fossils of the migratory Paleogene bird species have been found in both Arctic and subtropical fossil beds dating to the same time period, where fossils of non-homeothermic birds have not. Yes, and so this one, unlike B, does draw a distinction between homeothermic and non-homeothermic birds. And then on top of that, it really emphasizes this point that, they've been found in cold regions, but also warm regions. So subtropical, that means, if they're going to be found in the Arctic and in subtropical regions, that means that they've been migrating over long distances. And so that's going to support our argument. But just to check D, paleoclimate models suggest that average global temperatures were higher than they are today, reducing the need for... Okay, so that's talking about today, and this is talking about way back then. And so that's going to be irrelevant. And so that's exactly what we have here. We have our two irrelevant options. We have our correct one, and then we have our opposite one. But again, what makes our correct one correct is it simply supplies evidence that supports the claim. Okay, and now on to the second way that we can potentially strengthen an argument. This is a question that I did go over in a separate video about annotating and the ways in which some simple annotation can really help on these strengthen and weaken questions. But I'll go through it again here, emphasizing the theme of this video, which is, again, supplying that additional evidence when partial evidence is given. And so it says, as people have increasingly adopted digital calendars and task management apps, the act of memory-based planning has declined in favor of an approach known as externalized planning, in which individuals rely on digital tools to track and organize tasks. Okay, and so the annotation here would go something like this. Memory-based planning down, externalized planning up. This goes down, that goes up. Okay, these researchers analyzed data from a diverse sample of working professionals to evaluate participants' strength of EP or externalized planning usage, along with memory performance and organizational productivity. While they found no direct relationship between EP usage and productivity levels, they hypothesized that EP or externalized planning may reduce productivity through an indirect effect. Okay, so productivity, what are they saying about productivity? They're saying that EP usage, an increase in EP usage, would lead to a decrease in productivity levels. And so the indirect effect, that's going to have to be something that comes in here that connects, the increase in EP, externalized planning, to the decrease in productivity. So this would be our partial evidence that we have this inverse relationship between memory-based planning and externalized planning. We see that they carried out this study where they also analyzed memory performance, and that's kind of a clue here that memory performance is probably going to be relevant in terms of linking what we know about increased externalized planning and decreased productivity. So we go to our answer choices. A says that EP usage tends to increase during busy periods and people are generally more productive during busy periods than during slow periods. Well, the problem with that is that if EP usage increases during busy periods and people are more productive during busy periods, here we would expect productivity to go up. And so this is going to do the opposite of what we want. It would not support their hypothesis. It would suggest that the opposite relationship holds. So it's not going to be A. B, EP usage has a strong negative effect on memory performance, meaning that as EP increases, memory performance would decrease. And then if there is a known positive correlation between memory performance and organizational productivity, that would work, because a positive correlation just means that the arrows are pointing in the same direction. And so here, what we would be doing is supplying that additional evidence that is needed to link our, partial evidence to the conclusion, the idea that productivity is going to decrease as EP increases. And again, I mentioned that I went over this question in more detail in another video, and so I'll refer you to that one for a discussion of incorrect answer choices, C and D. And in the meantime, we'll go ahead and look at one example of our third way to strengthen an argument, and that has to do with weakening or ruling out alternative explanation. We'll go ahead and look at this example here, asking which finding would most strengthen the researcher's claim. So it says in the passage, in a recent observational study, researchers investigated whether natural sunlight within retail environments influences customer purchasing behavior. They examined a department store in which a large skylight illuminates approximately half of the store with natural sunlight during the day, while the other half is lit entirely by artificial lighting. Okay, so we've got our skylight and natural light coming in over here, and then artificial light coming in over there. And as it says, the researchers found that since the store's opening 2 years earlier, the departments located on the sunlit side of the store have consistently reported significantly higher sales than those on the artificially lit side. So we can say sales up, and over here sales down, or at least sales lower over here compared to on the sunlit side. And so it says the researchers concluded that the presence of natural sunlight explains the difference in sales between the halves of the store. So in other words, the fact that this side of the store is getting natural light and this one isn't explains the difference in sales. And so we have a conclusion, and then we have evidence, namely that, again, there has been this difference in sales between the two sides of the store. So it's not like the first example that we looked at in which we had a conclusion but no evidence. It's also not really like the second example in which we had a conclusion and then partial evidence and then a gap. So then how could we possibly strengthen it? Well, think about our theme here of alternative explanations. Can you think of anything else that might possibly explain why one side of the store has higher sales than the other side? I think there are plenty of potential alternative explanations, but the basic thrust of any such alternative would be that there is some other difference in the two halves of the store, some difference besides the presence or absence of sunlight. And so, given that we want to strengthen their argument or their conclusion or their claim, we might look for an answer choice that rules out such an alternative. Okay, so we go to the answer choices. A says that on cloudy days, the amount of artificial lighting used in the sunlit portion of the store increases. Okay, does that really make a difference? Let's think about it. Well, we still have higher sales over here, so even if we do have some cloudy days and we have to use a little bit of artificial lighting over here, this side of the store still has greater sales. So that's just going to basically be irrelevant. It's not going to strengthen it or really weaken it. B, on the other hand, during nighttime hours, the departments in the part of the store under the skylight have sales that are roughly equal to those of the other departments. Okay, so what does this do? this actually suggests that the sunlight is an important factor, because if we're talking about nighttime hours, there's not going to be sunlight coming through that skylight. And so that means that both sides of the store are going to be under the same lighting conditions. And if, when they are under the same lighting conditions, those sides of the store have roughly equal sales, that suggests that they are more or less equal in terms of, their baseline sales. And so that would strengthen this argument, because it would weaken, if not entirely rule out, it would weaken a potential objection, or again, a potential alternative explanation for the difference. C, customers frequently move between both sides of the store when making purchases. That's irrelevant, because regardless of whether they move between the different sides of the store, the argument is that the sales over here are greater. So they might spend time over here. They might even buy things from this side of the store, but they're buying more things from that side of the store, at least when the sunlight is coming through. And then D, in addition to the skylight, there are several other significant architectural differences between the two parts of the store. Okay, so this would be a potential alternative explanation. It's basically saying that, well, we can't necessarily attribute the difference to the skylight because we have some other differences, not specified in the answer choice, but we have some other differences that could also be contributing to it. They could perhaps even be contributing more than the sunlight is. So this is the one that would weaken the argument. And so if the question had asked us for something to weaken the researcher's claim, D would have been the way to go, and B would have been our opposite. But here we did want to strengthen it, so we want to go with B. Okay, now I will have a separate video on alternative explanations where I go into a few more examples, because again, it's a little bit more subtle, and I think it's the kind of thing that they're likely to continue incorporating into future tests, because the test is getting harder, and this is one way to make these questions harder. It's a little less obvious when you have to think about alternative explanations. Okay, as for, again, the second way to strengthen an argument, supplying that additional evidence, I'll once again refer you to actually 2 videos on annotating, a simple method for annotating on these questions. And then for the first method of strengthening an argument, simply supplying evidence, I'll have some more videos there too, talking about some different types of strengthen and weaken questions. And for example, ones involving timelines, ones involving competing theories or hypotheses, and possibly even some others.